Darkness clung to the high ramparts of Castle Black, and the swirling snow lent the night an endless hush, as though nature itself held its breath. Far in the distance, the wind moaned like some wounded animal prowling along the wall, a lonely lament that the living could not quite understand. But the tension of the moment, poised on the edge of violence, was felt in every heartbeat of those who stood watch. The torches sputtered as gusts of icy wind threatened to snuff them out. Cloaks flapped, drawn tight around chilled bodies, while high above, the first pale glow of dawn crept along the horizon, a tenuous promise of daylight that might not bring any warmth. Ygritte stood amid the chaos on the battlements, her bow clenched in her hands. The wood felt smooth beneath her raw, wind-chapped fingers. She was breathing fast but trying to steady herself. Her heart hammered in her chest as the Night's Watch defenders shouted orders, drew their own bows, and launched arrows into the pitch-black sky. Flaming projectiles arced overhead, trailing sparks before plunging into the courtyard or the ground beyond the gate. Somewhere below, the giant assault had begun in earnest, and the thunderous pounding against the gates throbbed like an ominous drumbeat. But up on the battlements, the wildlings had their own mission, to take control of the wall from inside. Ygritte's red hair spilled out from beneath her hood. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes were fierce. She scanned the ramparts for that telltale face, the black curls, the dark eyes. Jon Snow. She'd seen him earlier, their gazes locking across the chaos as the wildlings took a tower. She had tried to steel herself for this moment, had thought she could handle it. Jon was a crow again, a brother of the Night's Watch. He'd abandoned her, or that was how it felt. Her anger had simmered ever since he'd left, swirling in her mind every hour of the day. Her love for him clashed against her sense of betrayal, and it twisted inside her like a blade. She wanted to kill him. She wanted to hold him. The confusion overwhelmed her. But in the end, she was still a wildling, and he was wearing black once more. The voices of her fellow wildlings shouted over the wind. Some had found vantage points along the stone walkway, loosing arrows at crows rushing to defend from above. Steel clashed somewhere near the far turret, accompanied by shouts of pain and fury. Ygritte tried to drown out the sounds, tried to focus on the next arrow she notched. Her vision tunneled, fixed on any sign of her target. He might appear at any moment, and if she hesitated, it would be too late. One or both of them might die. She forced her mind to recall the times they had shared. The small cave with the hot spring, where the steam had enveloped them in warmth and secrecy, where they had learned each other's bodies and hearts. It seemed a lifetime ago, and in that memory lay the sting of their final farewell. He had left her. He had lied to her, but it didn't stop her heart from yearning for him, nor did it quiet that small voice whispering that she couldn't bring herself to loose an arrow if he stood before her unarmed. Yet now, as the cold night pressed in, and the battle raged on every side, Jon Snow was not unarmed. He was a Night's Watch brother, sword in hand, determined to defend Castle Black. That was the truth of it. And so Ygritte told herself fiercely that he had made his choice. Her cheeks burned with tears she refused to let fall. This was war. This was the reality of the free folk against the crows. She had to kill him if he stood in their way. Her eyes caught movement across the courtyard. There he was, his black hair damp with sweat, snow swirling around him, sword in hand, the rippling dark cloak on his shoulders. He shouted orders, though Ygritte could not hear his words over the wild wind and the din of battle. He looked up, searching for targets, scanning the battlements, and then his eyes found her. There was a pause, an almost surreal stillness in the midst of the clamor. Their gazes locked. Something like recognition flashed across his features, a mixture of regret, pain, love. Maybe. Her own heart clenched so tight that she felt she couldn't breathe. Jon Snow began to raise his hand, perhaps to call out to her, perhaps to parley in the middle of this madness. Ygritte thought she saw him mouth her name. Her fingers were on the bowstring, arrow knocked. She could have lowered her weapon, could have turned away. But her body moved of its own volition, driven by a surging mixture of heartbreak, anger, and survival. She drew the bowstring taut, and in that single moment, it was as if the world went silent. She could see only him, his dark eyes so wide, his mouth open as if on the cusp of a plea. Then she released the arrow. It flew with a twang and hissed through the frigid air. For an instant, Ygritte did not know whether she had loosed it properly or if her arms had betrayed her. She felt the recoil, the snap of tension. The arrow sliced through the space between them. Ygritte's breath caught as if she had been struck herself. Jon Snow stumbled. The arrow had found its mark, protruded from his chest, just below his collarbone. His expression twisted with shock and betrayal. She had shot him, truly. Blood blossomed on his black tunic, a dark stain spreading in the shape of a flower. He staggered back, tried to stay on his feet, but the strength seemed to drain from his limbs. He sank to his knees, confusion and agony etched into his face. Ygritte stood, transfixed, her bow still in hand. Another arrow was notched on instinct, though she did not remember doing it. Her mind was blank. Her ears rang with the roar of her heartbeat. Jon collapsed forward, propped on one hand, then the other, as though fighting every fiber of his being not to fall. His sword clattered to the stones, its ring echoing above the howling wind. She saw his lips move, forming her name, and then he slumped onto the walkway, face down against the cold stone. The chaos continued around them. Crows shooting from one side, wildlings climbing rope ladders from another. But in Ygritte's world, time slowed to a stillness. She could only stare at the man she had loved, lying motionless in the drifting snow. She wanted to rush to him to see if he still breathed, to take it back, to reverse the world somehow. But her legs felt rooted in place. Was he alive? Could she help? Slowly, she started toward him, her steps halting. Behind her, she heard Tormund Giantsbane shout, "Ygritte, hold your ground!" But Tormund's voice seemed distant, muffled, unimportant. None of it mattered if Jon was gone. Her soul felt torn in two. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she thought. Even at her most furious, she had not truly imagined living in a world where he lay dead by her hand. She knelt beside him, dropping her bow. Her hands hovered over his body, unsure where to touch, because the arrow was lodged in his chest. Blood stained her gloves as she tried to turn him onto his back. A faint rattle came from his throat. His eyes fluttered half open. She tried to speak, but no words came, only a strangled sob. He gazed up at her one last time, or so it seemed, his breath rattling, his features contorted with pain, and then something in him slipped away. Ygritte felt it like a tangible thing, the final exhalation of his soul. His eyes went still, his hands, which had been clutching at her, relaxed their grip. He was gone. Crows in black cloaks were scrambling along the walkway, engaged in bitter combat with wildlings. A spear whistled by, missing Ygritte by inches. Still, she couldn't move from Jon's side. She clutched his shoulders, wanting to scream. She bent her head over him, tears burning down her cheeks, though the wind tried to freeze them. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. She had done this. She had ended him, ended everything they might have been to each other. She did not care that she was still in the midst of a battle. She did not care that she might die next. She did not care about the free folks' cause. All she could see was the body of the man she loved, the man she had betrayed, or who had betrayed her first. None of it seemed worth this anguish. A shadow fell across her. One of the Black brothers loomed with a sword raised high. In a flash, Tormund's thick arm crashed into the attacker, driving him away with a roar. Blood spattered, and the night's watchman crumpled. Tormund grabbed Ygritte by the shoulders and hauled her up. "Ygritte!" he bellowed above the noise. "Now's not the time to mourn." She could scarcely hear him through the roaring in her ears, but she felt him shake her. His face was a map of fury and concern, the braided beard crusted with ice and blood. He glanced at Jon's body, and she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You shot him?" Tormund asked, half in disbelief. When she didn't respond, he pulled her away, giving her a moment to scoop up her bow. The walkway was thick with new bodies, the fight surging. Arrows whistled overhead, the wildling war cries intermingling with the shouts of crows. Down below, the outer gate sounded like it was cracking. Ygritte let Tormund lead her away from Jon's corpse. She barely registered what was happening. The shock settled over her like a heavy blanket, numbing her to everything except the agony in her chest. Her arrow was the cause of his death. The knowledge hammered at her. Her vision blurred with tears. She could still feel the memory of him in her arms, that longing in his eyes. All around them, the Night's Watchmen were rallying. Under the command of Ser Alistair Thorne and others, archers lined the walls. They rained down arrow after arrow upon the free folk who tried to clamber up the wall's interior or force their way through the smaller entrances. Tormund guided Ygritte toward a group of wildlings taking cover behind crates of supplies, cursing as the crows concentrated fire on them. "Tormund, we need to pull back," another wildling hissed, an arrow protruding from his thigh. "We're getting slaughtered." Tormund's face was grim. Mance's orders were to take the castle from inside. "We can't just run off." Ygritte slumped against the crate, tears frozen on her face. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She looked at her blood-stained hands. Jon's blood. Her mind wouldn't move beyond that fact. She couldn't even muster the strength to speak. She wanted to scream at Tormund to forget the mission, to do something, to let her go back to Jon. But it was too late. Tormund's broad hand squeezed her shoulder. "Ygritte, snap out of it. We need your arrows. They're good arrows. The crows will kill us all if we sit here. He's gone, girl. I'm sorry." She gazed up at Tormund, trying to blink away her tears, and some part of her recognized the concern in his voice. He might be a wildling with a fierce reputation, but beneath the bear-like exterior lay a heart that cared for his people. And Ygritte was his people. She could see in his eyes that he understood her grief, though no words could ease it. A younger wildling near them screamed in pain as an arrow lodged in his shoulder. Tormund growled, "We need to fight or we'll end up like him. That Jared Ygritte." She turned her gaze to the ramparts above, where more black shapes converged. The free folk around her drew their weapons, returning fire whenever possible. Ygritte numbly picked up her bow, forced herself to notch an arrow. She drew the string back, the motion automatic, and she loosed into the fray, hardly aiming. Another arrow. Another. She tried to focus on the mechanical rhythm to blot out everything else. Arrows soared, swords clashed. Men died. Somewhere in the swirl of chaos, dawn broke, a pale, ghostly light. By the time the sun rose fully, the courtyard was littered with bodies of wildlings and black brothers alike. Soot from burning siege equipment clung to the air. The wind carried the stench of blood, sweat, and fear. Castle Black's walls were smeared with crimson where men had fought hand to hand. The relentless assault on the main gate from the outside had not succeeded. The massive construction was battered but still held. Meanwhile, the defenders had begun to tighten their hold inside the castle, systematically pushing back the smaller wildling force that had infiltrated from the south. Ygritte found herself and a handful of wildlings pinned near the granary building. She didn't know where Tormund was. He had charged off with a roar, hacking his way through a line of crows. The last she'd seen, he was bleeding from a gash in his arm. But Tormund was not the type to drop easily. She hoped he still lived. A horn blast echoed along the walls, reverberating in the cold morning. The men of the Night's Watch cheered in unison. For a moment, Ygritte wondered if this was a signal of a new wave of crows arriving. From her vantage point, she could see only a swirl of black cloaks rushing from the towers to root out the remaining wildlings. They were coordinated, working in small teams. Her group was outnumbered, half of them injured, and with the morning light, the advantage of darkness was gone. A black-haired man in a steward's cloak, Samwell Tarly, stumbled into view, crossbow in hand, shouting for others to follow. Ygritte recognized him from times before, though they'd never spoken. He was one of Jon Snow's closest friends. Her heart gave a painful lurch at the thought. He had come to defend his home, though he seemed hesitant, even frightened. An older black brother, face hidden by the rim of his helmet, bellowed commands. "Drive them back. No quarter." The Lord Commander wants this ended. Ygritte grit her teeth, launching arrows as the crows advanced. It was a desperate stand. Beside her, a wildling woman pitched forward, an arrow through her back. A man to her left tried to throw his axe but was shot down. Ygritte's quiver was nearly empty, and her arm trembled from the strain of constant firing. The watchers approached with swords out. She prepared to go down fighting, to make them pay for every foot of ground. But before the Black brothers closed the distance, she heard a call from the ramparts. One of the men was shouting, "Yield! Drop your weapons!" It took a moment for her to realize that the crows were offering quarter after all. Perhaps it was more beneficial to take prisoners or glean information about Mance Raiders' next move. Whatever the reason, Ygritte saw how her wildling companions faltered, glancing among themselves. Some were mortally wounded, slumped in the snow. Others pressed hands to bleeding gashes, too weary to keep fighting. For them, surrender might be the only path to survival. Ygritte's mind raced, torn between the memories of Jon's body, lying cold, and the knowledge that continuing to fight likely meant a quick death. The thunder at the gate had subsided. She guessed the main assault outside must have failed, at least for now, which meant the infiltration plan had also failed. The free folk here were cut off, surrounded. She stood, blood spattered across her furs, her red hair half frozen with sweat and snow, and let her bow hang loosely in her grip. 5 arrows left in her quiver. She saw Samwell Tarly come forward carefully, crossbow wavering. He was flanked by 2 more Black brothers. They called out again, "Yield!" The men and women around her slowly laid down their weapons. Ygritte, breath shuddering in her chest, let her bow slip from her grip. She dropped it to the icy stone. It landed with a dull clatter. She raised her hands, feeling something deep inside her shutting down. It was as if all color had drained from the world. Without Jon Snow, she did not care if she lived or died. But she did not want to be cut down in a pointless last stand. She would surrender for now. The crows swiftly disarmed them, binding their wrists, and led them into the courtyard. Bodies littered the ground. Ygritte's gaze flicked across the snow, searching for a glimpse of Jon's black cloak, but she couldn't see it. Her stomach lurched, her eyes burned with unshed tears. She was not sure she could bear to see him again if they had left his body strewn out in the open. They were corralled near a set of barrels, guarded by half a dozen Black brothers. One of them spit at Ygritte's feet, muttering curses under his breath. Another recognized her from previous skirmishes. She heard them whisper about the red-haired wildling who was once rumored to be with Jon Snow. Ygritte kept her head down, exhaustion pressing her shoulders. Her wrists ached from the bindings. Around her, the surviving wildlings shifted uneasily, fear in their eyes. It was then that Ser Alliser Thorne strode across the courtyard, stepping over corpses, a scowl on his hard face. His black cloak was spattered with mud and blood, his sword still unsheathed. The men parted for him. He stopped in front of Ygritte's group, looking them over with barely concealed contempt. Then he locked eyes with her. "So you're the infamous Ygritte," he said, voice rough as gravel. "You helped that traitor Snow when he was among your people." She felt a spike of anger at hearing Jon called a traitor, but her voice was dull when she spoke. "He was never your enemy. He wanted peace. And look what you did." Alliser's lips curled in distaste. "My men tell me he's dead now, with an arrow in his chest. He died in the line of duty, protecting Castle Black. Don't you speak ill of him, wildling." She grit her teeth, tears threatening again. It was too painful. "I speak ill of no one," she muttered softly. "I loved him." Alliser's gaze narrowed, but she saw the flicker in his eyes. Perhaps he was recalling the tension between himself and Jon, the arguments, the mistrust. His feelings about Jon Snow were complicated. But Alliser did not linger on that. Instead, he gestured to the other Black brothers. "Separate her from the rest. Lock her in an ice cell. The rest will go to the common cells until we decide their fate." The men dragged Ygritte away, her steps stumbling. She tried to keep her head high, but anguish weighed heavy on her heart. She had never felt so alone. Even among her fellow free folk, she'd once had him. Now, in captivity, Jon was gone, and she was adrift, as though some crucial part of her soul had been ripped away. She barely noticed as they shoved her into a cramped room carved from the ice, a makeshift prison where the cold sank through her bones. They chained her to the wall, left her with only a thin blanket. When the door slammed shut, the darkness rushed in, and in that moment, Ygritte pressed her face against her bound wrists, letting out a broken sound that might have been a sob. She had dreamt of crossing the wall with Jon, to find a life of freedom and love, somewhere they wouldn't be burdened by the petty wars of the living. But that dream had died with him. She had snuffed it out herself with a single arrow. In the hours that followed, the men of Castle Black worked tirelessly to clear the courtyard of bodies. Some of the wildlings who still lived were given a chance to burn their dead, in accordance with the knowledge that the dead must not rise again. The watchmen did the same for their own. A somber hush enveloped the fortress. The stench of death lingered in the air. Samwell Tarly tried to help wherever he could, though he was shaken to his core. Jon Snow had been the bravest man he knew, the friend who had given him confidence. Jon had protected him from bullies, from worse. Now he lay cold and stiff in the makeshift morgue that served the night's watch. Sam had volunteered to help prepare Jon's body for the funeral pyre, but his hands trembled, and he found he could do little more than stare at Jon's pale face and remind himself to breathe. Another brother, a kindly older man named Dolorous Ed, patted Sam's shoulder and whispered that it would be all right, though Ed's eyes shone with grief. They placed Jon's body on a simple wooden table in one of the adjoining rooms near the courtyard. His cloak was folded neatly to the side, his sword placed upon it. The arrow had been removed, the wound roughly stitched, though there was no life left in Jon's chest. His eyes were closed. They had tried to wipe away most of the blood, but the dark stain on his tunic was still visible. Sam kept thinking Jon would open his eyes and say, "Well, go on, Sam. Can't wait forever." But that never happened. Sam's heart felt hollow. Ser Alliser Thorne, now the de facto leader after the Lord Commander's demise in the mutiny at Craster's Keep and with no official successor yet named, ordered that Jon Snow be given a proper funeral. He might have despised Jon, but Thorne knew that morale among the men depended on acknowledging the bravery of fallen brothers. And Jon's actions, however misguided Alliser might have believed them to be, had bought time for Castle Black. The infiltration of the wildlings had been mostly contained. The gates had held. A day later, when the fires were ready, the Night's Watch gathered in the courtyard. Torches illuminated the twilight sky, and the swirling snow lent a solemn grace to the ceremony. Jon's body was carried out on a simple wooden stretcher. Sam walked behind, tears tracking silently down his cheeks. Ed walked beside him, face set like stone. The rest of the watch arrayed around them in a respectful ring, heads bowed. No one spoke for a long time, as the wind howled against the high walls. Then Ser Alliser Thorne cleared his throat. "Brothers," he began, his voice echoing, "we gather to honor Jon Snow, who fell defending Castle Black from the wildlings. He was the son of Lord Eddard Stark, though he served as true a brother of the Night's Watch as any man. We commit his body to the flames, so that he may not rise again. We pray his soul finds peace beyond this realm." His words were formal, almost distant, but Sam knew it was the best eulogy Alliser could manage. Silence descended once more, broken only by the crackle of the torches. A few men stepped forward to place their torches on the pyre, Sam among them. The wood caught quickly. Flames licked upward, illuminating Jon's still face for a final moment before the heat began to distort it. Sam felt a sob welling in his throat. He forced himself to stay, to watch until the flames consumed the body of his friend. If he had fled, if he had hidden, it would have been a disservice to Jon's memory. Amid the flickering firelight, Sam glimpsed something that made his heart stutter. A red-haired woman, in chains, standing under heavy guard on the far side of the courtyard, forced to witness the burning of Jon Snow. It was Ygritte. Alliser had evidently decided that seeing the crow she loved consumed by fire might be a fitting lesson. She stood trembling, tears reflecting the fire, her eyes wide and hollow. Sam looked away, unable to bear the depth of her anguish. That night, the men of the watch returned to their duties, watchers on the wall. Though they had won a reprieve, Mance Rayder's army still lay camped beyond the wall, with giants, mammoths, and thousands of free folk ready to strike again. Jon Snow had believed that a peaceful solution was possible. Without him, the Night's Watch was left with men like Ser Alliser, men who would never trust the wildlings. The future felt bleak, yet time pressed forward. Days turned into nights, nights into days. Life at Castle Black settled into a grim routine of repair and vigilance. The battered gate had to be reinforced, the breaches in the walls filled with rubble, the surviving men given shifts on the top of the wall, scanning the white plains for movement. Every time a horn sounded, tension coiled in every belly, for it could mean Mance Rayder's renewed assault. In that hush between battles, rumors spread about what would become of the wildling prisoners. Some said they would be executed. Others said they might be used as bargaining chips or forced into labor to repair the damage from the attack. Ser Alliser seemed to revel in their powerlessness. He was a stern man, hardened by the harshness of the North, and he had no love for the free folk, especially after losing men in the assault. In the ice cell, Ygritte felt each day blur into the next. They brought her sparse meals, a bit of bread, a bowl of thin stew. There was no fire, no comfort. Her only warmth was the tattered blanket. She wore her furs, but they were damp with melted ice. The cold seeped into her bones, making her body ache. She seldom spoke to the guards, who never responded with anything but jeers or glares. Once, she asked what had become of Jon's body, but the guard merely spat and walked away. She had witnessed the pyre from a distance, but she wanted to know everything. Had they treated him with respect, or had they discarded him like trash? She had no answers. Some nights, she would slip into feverish sleep, dreaming of him. His smile, the dark curls against his forehead, the warmth of his arms in that cave. She would wake with a start, alone in the ice cell, tears freezing on her lashes. The guilt pressed down on her like an avalanche. She hated herself for that final arrow, for losing control. She cursed the war, cursed the watch, cursed the wildlings who had brought them to this. And mostly, she cursed fate for taking him from her, even though it had been her own hand. Weeks passed, though it was hard to measure time in the darkness. Then, one day, the door to her cell was thrown open. 2 black brothers entered, carrying torches that made her wince at the sudden brightness. She blinked, cowering against the wall, her body stiff and weak from cold and inactivity. One brother, a tall man with a grim scar across his face, jerked his head. "On your feet, wildling. You've been summoned." She frowned. Summoned by who? Her voice was rough from disuse. He sneered. "The new Lord Commander, if that's what he'll be soon enough. Come on up." She forced herself to stand, though her legs felt like ice. The chain rattled as they unlocked it from the wall, then locked her wrists behind her back. They marched her through corridors she scarcely recognized, up staircases, until they reached a corridor leading to the common hall. Along the way, she caught glimpses of men in black, some wounded, others fresh recruits. They stared at her with open hostility or pity. Finally, they shoved her into a small chamber. A single brazier glowed in one corner, offering a hint of warmth. A table stood in the center with chairs on either side. Ser Alliser Thorne waited there, flanked by 2 more men in black cloaks. She saw Samwell Tarly at the back of the room, looking nervous, his hands twisting together. Alliser didn't waste time. "Sit her down." She was forced onto a chair, the guards standing on either side. Alliser leaned forward, his gaunt features illuminated by the brazier's light. "You've been rotting in that cell for a while now. I trust you're suitably broken in spirit." Ygritte lifted her chin, mustering what courage she had. "What do you want?" He regarded her with cold disdain. "You're one of the more prominent wildlings in our custody. Tormund Giantsbane was also taken, but that savage's injuries were severe. He may not survive." The rest of your folk are in holding cells, awaiting our decision. But you were close to Jon Snow, or so everyone says. You must know something of Mance Rayder's plans." She inhaled sharply, her eyes flicking to Sam. He looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I won't betray my people, and I'm no use to you anyway. Jon told you all he knew about Mance's intentions. He wanted peace." Alliser's scowl deepened. "Peace? More like he wanted to open the gate to let your savage horde slaughter us in our beds. Jon Snow was a traitor once, but he died defending us. I'll give him that." His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. "But you are not him, and you have no reason to do anything but spit at our feet." A tense silence fell. Ygritte could feel the eyes of the guards on her. The cold was still in her bones, but she forced herself not to shiver. "If you're going to kill me, just do it," she said at last, voice hollow. "I've lost everything that mattered." Alliser exchanged a glance with one of the men. "Perhaps that would be too kind, but there may be a better use for you. Word has reached us that Mance Rayder demands our surrender or face another assault. He's giving us time to consider. He wants the gate opened. He thinks we're weakened now, but we have reinforcements on the way. Some southern lords have promised men, or so the ravens say. If we can hold out long enough, Mance will fail. The thing is, the men are weary and morale is low. I need to make an example or gain leverage. Something that shows the wildlings we won't be bullied." Ygritte narrowed her eyes. "And you think using me will accomplish that?" Alliser shrugged. "We'll see. If Mance values you, if you were one of his folk of any prominence, he might hold back his next assault. We could arrange a parley. Or maybe we'll just hang you from the top of the wall, so he sees what happens to those who cross the Night's Watch." Sam let out a small gasp. "Ser Alliser, that seems cruel." Alliser shot him a withering glare. "I am aware of your opinion, Tarly, but I am the ranking officer here. Unless you intend to challenge me." Sam's face flushed, and he ducked his head. Ygritte felt anger spark inside her. Jon had died for these men, and they repaid him by torturing the people he cared about. "You men of the Watch, you claim honor, but you're just as cruel as any other." Alliser bared his teeth in a semblance of a smile. "We do what we must to protect the realm. Now, let's see if you're cooperative enough to serve our ends. If not, I'll see you hanged. Or better yet, burned. Doesn't matter much to me." She swallowed hard. Either option sounded like a nightmare, but the prospect of being used as a bargaining chip or a prisoner displayed in some cruel spectacle made her skin crawl. Still, she was powerless, bound, and alone in Castle Black. She had no illusions about her ability to fight free of these men. She could only wait, see what fate had in store. Alliser gestured for the guards to take her back. "We'll keep you here in a slightly less miserable cell for the time being. Perhaps you'll be more forthcoming in a few days. If not, you'll die." He waved them away, and the guards hauled Ygritte up to her feet, dragging her out the door. She managed one last glance at Sam, who looked troubled. She couldn't glean comfort from that, only sadness that Jon's friend seemed unable to help. They moved her to a stone cell with a small window slit, still cold and uncomfortable, but far better than the ice hole she'd inhabited. The guards bound her ankles loosely so she could shuffle around but not run. They locked the door behind her. The window showed a slice of gray sky. Outside, the wind howled, but at least in here, she wasn't chained to a wall of ice. She curled up against the stone and tried to will away the numbness in her limbs. Time trickled by, measured only by the changes in light through the window slit and the occasional meal. She caught the faint echoes of horns, men shouting. Tension was thick in the air. She guessed Mance Rayder was preparing another push, or perhaps negotiations were in the works. Ygritte thought of Tormund, lying injured somewhere in this fortress. Was he still alive? Had he succumbed to his wounds? She longed to see him, to have some comfort from someone who knew her, but that seemed impossible now. She was alone. She drifted into a restless sleep, nightmares plaguing her. She dreamed of Jon's face over and over, the arrow piercing his chest, the look in his eyes. She awoke drenched in sweat, tears on her cheeks. She pressed her hands to her face, feeling the dryness of her skin, cracked from the cold. She wondered if she would ever feel warmth again, or hope. After an indeterminate number of days, the door opened again, and Samuel Tarly stepped inside, accompanied by a single guard. The guard glared at Ygritte, but Sam cleared his throat. "Ser Alistair sent me to speak with you," Sam said, his tone hesitant. "He wants to know if you've changed your mind about cooperating." She stared at Sam from her corner. "Cooperating how?" Sam shrugged, fiddling with his cloak. "Ser Alistair says you might be able to help us figure out Mance's next move, or maybe you could be used to draw him out to parley. He thinks you might hold enough sway that Mance would come for you, or at least be willing to talk." Ygritte gave a bitter laugh. "Mance doesn't do anything he doesn't want to. He might come for me, or he might let me die if it means saving the rest of the free folk. I'm not that important. I was just another spearwife in his army." Sam's brows furrowed. "But you were close to Jon. There might be significance in that." She felt her throat tighten. "Jon's gone. No amount of significance can change that." Sam knelt awkwardly, careful to keep some distance. The guard hovered near the door, eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry," Sam said softly. "I miss him too. He was my friend." Ygritte looked away, her voice thick. "Your friend, your brother. You fought beside him, and I—" She couldn't say the words. They lodged in her throat like shards of ice. Sam nodded, his eyes full of sorrow. "We all lost him, but I don't blame you entirely. This war, it took so much from all of us." He let out a shaky sigh. "I want to find a way to end it, but Ser Alistair, he's not the sort to seek a peaceful solution. He just wants to hold the wall until reinforcements come, then crush the wildlings. That's all." She swallowed. "Jon wanted something else." Sam's gaze flicked down. "He did. He thought we should let the wildlings through the gate, let them pass as long as they agreed not to harm the lands in the north. He believed that the real threat was out there." He gestured vaguely, meaning the White Walkers, the Whites, everything beyond the wall. "But with him gone, Ser Alistair has the final say. And he hates your people. He wants me to glean what information I can from you, where Mance's armies are massed, how many giants remain, all that. Otherwise, he's threatened to, well..." Ygritte nodded, understanding. "He'll kill me." Sam swallowed hard. "I don't want that. I'm not a torturer. I'm not a killer. I promised Jon I'd do whatever I could to protect the realm." She studied him for a moment. This soft, kind-hearted crow had once run from danger, had once been too scared to even hold a blade. Yet here he was, trying to do what he thought was right. She had no illusions that she could manipulate him easily. He was earnest, but not entirely naive. Still, she saw a glimmer of compassion that none of the others offered. "I don't know if Mance has enough men left to assault the gate again," she said quietly. "We lost a lot that night, maybe thousands, but what remains is still strong, and Mance might press on if he thinks the crows are weak. He's a stubborn man. He wants us free. If you're asking for details, I have none. I've been locked away, no messages. But if you think using me as a hostage will stop him, you're wrong." Sam rubbed his chin. "That's what I was afraid of." He let out a deep breath. "Look, if you cooperate at least a little, maybe I can convince Ser Alistair not to harm you. Maybe we can negotiate a prisoner exchange. Tormund Giantsbane is also in our custody." Her eyes flicked up. "He lives." Sam gave a short nod. "He was badly wounded, but he's recovering. Ser Alistair has him chained up in the tower cells. I'm sure they intend to use him as a bargaining chip too." Hope flickered in her chest, then died again. Tormund might still be alive, but that meant the crows had a powerful piece in their game. "I see." She considered her choices. If she remained silent, Alistair would likely execute her in some gruesome display. If she told them everything she knew, it might earn her a brief reprieve, but ultimately it wouldn't change the fact that Mance and Alistair were on a collision course. Sam's voice softened further. "If Jon were here, he would want me to help you, to try to save you." His eyes shone with unshed tears. "Maybe that sounds strange to you, but it's true. You meant something to him. He never said so openly, but I could tell. Ygritte's heart clenched again, that familiar ache surging. She bowed her head, refusing to let tears fall. If you want me to talk, I can share what I know, though it's likely nothing you haven't heard. The free folk are scattered. Many fear the others more than they fear you, but they have nowhere to go. Mance is convinced he has to get us south of the wall before winter truly descends. If he can't force the gate, he may try other routes or wait for a moment of weakness. That's all. Sam nodded slowly. I'll tell Ser Alicer. Thank you. She shrugged, feeling the weight of hopelessness. It won't save me, but maybe it'll buy me time. Sam rose to his feet, dusting off his cloak. I'll do what I can. I promise. She watched him leave, feeling oddly numb. Whatever came next, she sensed that this wasn't leading to peace. It was leading to a final clash, one in which the wildlings would either break through or die trying. And all the while, the real threat beyond the wall loomed, unstoppable by petty human conflicts. Jon had tried to warn them to bring unity, but the unity was broken along with his life. In the days that followed, Alicer tried to use Ygritte as leverage. He sent a raven to Mance Raider's camp, offering a parley at a spot a league south of the wall in exchange for the release of certain wildling prisoners. If Mance refused, he threatened to kill Ygritte and Tormund, publicly. The message returned with curt words from Mance. He would not be cowed by threats to individuals, however dear they might be. Freedom for the free folk was paramount. He demanded the gate be opened or they would storm the wall again, no matter the cost. Ser Alicer read this reply aloud in the courtyard, loud enough for the wildling prisoners to hear. He cast a scornful glance at Ygritte, who had been dragged out to stand in shackles. Well, it seems your Mance Raider does not value your life as much as you thought, he sneered. She didn't flinch. Her heart sank, but she had never expected Mance to capitulate. He was fighting for all their people. No one life could sway him. Alicer turned to his men. Prepare the garrison. He'll come at us again. Let's see what our new recruits from the south can do. And as for our prisoners, keep them locked up. We may have one more trick to play when the battle begins. Ygritte was shoved back into her cell, bitterness chewing at her insides. She had to accept that she was nothing but a pawn. Mance wouldn't trade the fate of thousands for her. The best she could hope for was that the Watch might decide to keep her alive in case a future negotiation seemed possible. But if Mance attacked in full force, Ser Alicer might choose to execute her as a symbol of the Watch's resolve. Outside, the nights grew darker and colder. The fresh recruits from the south trickled in, a ragtag group of volunteers and sellswords, not nearly enough to man the entire wall effectively, but enough to bolster Castle Black's defenses. The men braced for a siege. Rumors flew that Mance was massing what remained of his mammoths and giants for a final assault. They would come in wave after wave, trying to break through. It was in this tense lull that Ygritte received an unexpected visitor one evening. Tormund Giantsbane himself. 2 black brothers escorted him into her cell. Tormund limped, one arm in a sling. A thick scab ran across his forehead. Yet he managed to keep an imposing presence, his broad chest rising and falling as he caught sight of her. The guards unshackled Ygritte from the wall but kept her hands bound behind her back. They told Tormund to speak quickly, then stepped outside. For a moment, Tormund simply stared, his eyes red-rimmed. Then he let out a heavy sigh. I heard about Jon. I'm sorry, lass. Ygritte's chest tightened. She didn't know what to say. Tormund was the first wildling she'd spoken to since that day. She saw the grief in his posture, though he tried to mask it. Tormund had liked Jon, had even respected him for fighting with them. I did it, she managed in a broken whisper. I shot him. Tormund stepped closer, leaning against the wall. His voice was rough. I heard. Word travels. Some say you had no choice. Others say you were raging mad because he turned on us. Doesn't matter now, does it? Her eyes were wet. No, it doesn't matter. Tormund clenched his good hand into a fist. I like that crow, but war does things to us. He exhaled. We have to live with what we've done or try to. She hung her head. I can't see how. They stood in silence for a stretch. Then Tormund looked at the tiny window slit. Ser Alistair thinks Mance is coming soon. The crows are mustering. They brought me here so I could talk sense into you. Or maybe so we could see how hopeless it is. I'm not sure which. She let out a bitter laugh. He wants me to betray Mance. He wants you to do the same, I reckon. Tormund barked a humorless laugh. Ha! And serve who? That sour-faced bastard Thorn? I'd sooner freeze in the snow. We're free folk, Ygritte, or we die trying to be free. She met his gaze, a flicker of the old fierceness in her eyes. Aye. Tormund's expression softened. Listen, I might have a plan. It's a slim one, mind you, but I'd rather try than let them use us as trophies. She leaned forward. What is it? He glanced at the door. We only have a moment, so listen well. During the next battle, chaos will reign. The crows will focus on defending the gate. Mance will send in the giants again, or so the talk goes. Some men inside the castle are rumored to be loyal to one of the new southern lords, who might not be so keen on Alistair's leadership. There's confusion among them. If we can break free in that confusion, get to the gate controls, we might help Mance's forces from the inside. Ygritte's eyes widened. Open the gate? Tormund nodded. Or at least sabotage the defenses. Let the mammoths break through. We do that and we might slip out in the chaos. It's that or die in these cells when Alistair's had enough of us. She inhaled, a swirl of fear and determination coiling in her gut. Could they do it? She remembered Jon's last wish, that the wildlings be allowed to pass south. And yet, if they forced their way in, how many more men of the Watch would die? How many more of her own people would fall? This was the opposite of the peace Jon had wanted. But with no one else to champion that peace, the only outcome seemed to be slaughter unless the wildlings gained the upper hand. What do you need me to do? She asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Tormund's lips curved into a grim smile. I have to confirm a few details. Make sure we have an opening. Watch for my signal once the fight begins. I'll get you out of the cell, or you me. We'll do what we must. The crows will be too busy to stop us, if the time is right. Ygritte felt a tremor of anticipation. She had no illusions that this plan was likely to fail, but at least it was something. She would not simply wait to be executed. Tormund patted her bound shoulder. Stay strong, lass. Jon's gone, but we're still here, and our people need us. She nodded, swallowing. Aye, Tormund. At that moment, the door swung open, and the guards stepped in, glaring. They hauled Tormund away and locked Ygritte's shackles back to the wall ring. She sank down, hugging her knees, trying to keep her face a mask of resignation. But inside, her mind churned with the possibility of escape. Part of her felt a flicker of life returning, though it was fueled by heartbreak and a desire for retribution. Another part of her remained hollow, mourning Jon. It was not long before the horns sounded, echoing across Castle Black, announcing the arrival of Mance's final assault. Ygritte felt the tremors through the stones of her cell as men rushed to battle stations, as war horns from the free folk howled across the wastes. She heard the bellow of giants, distant but unmistakable, and the thunderous beat of mammoths pounding against the frozen ground. The crows scrambled to defend the wall, manning the catapults and scorpions. Chaos enveloped the fortress. Bells clanged, men shouted, and the shrieking wind carried the sounds of battle. Ygritte waited, her breath quickening. The plan Tormund had spoken of, would he come for her? Could she free herself? Perhaps her moment would present itself. She heard a commotion in the corridor. The door to her cell flew open, and a young black brother stumbled in, sword in hand, eyes wild. He looked her over and then swiftly jammed the blade into the lock on her chains. She gasped, trying to recoil, but realized he was prying the lock open. With a grunt, he snapped the chain. The shackles around her wrists fell away. She scrambled to her feet, rubbing her bruised wrists. "Who are you?" she demanded. He didn't answer. He just beckoned her. "Now's your chance. Get out." Startled, She paused for half a heartbeat. But the fighting outside grew louder, and she saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't acting under Alistair's orders. Perhaps he was loyal to some southern lord who wanted to see Alistair fail, or perhaps he thought the watch had lost already. She didn't wait for further explanation. She darted out, glancing left and right down the corridors. To her right, she heard shouting. She turned left, running lightly, pressing herself flat against the cold stone walls whenever she heard footsteps. Every corridor was a tangle of men in black rushing to and fro, calling out positions, dragging weapons. No one seemed to notice her in the dim torchlight, especially since she still wore furs that were mostly dark. She kept low, searching for any sign of Tormund. The fortress shook with the thunder of impacts. She guessed the giants were ramming the gates again, that the catapults were launching fire. The stench of smoke and burning pitch reached her nostrils. She finally slipped outside into the open air, hugging the shadows. The courtyard was a scene of pandemonium. Flaming arrows arced overhead, screams and war cries filled the night. The gate was still closed, but under tremendous strain. The defenders on the ramparts above hurled barrels of flaming oil at the wildlings and mammoths below. Ygritte spotted Tormund near a collapsed section of scaffolding. He was grappling with two black brothers, roaring in fury. She snatched a dagger from a fallen man nearby and sprinted across the courtyard. An arrow whistled past her ear, narrowly missing. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surging. Tormund managed to slam one brother's head against the scaffolding, dropping him. The other swung a sword, slicing Tormund's upper arm. Tormund howled and bashed the man's face with a gauntlet fist. The black brother went down, blood streaming from his nose. Tormund, panting, looked up to see Ygritte. Relief flickered in his eyes. "Took you long enough," he rasped. She stabbed a black brother who lunged at her from the side. Her movements felt automatic, fueled by desperation. The man collapsed, clutching his wound. She felt a surge of nausea at the sight of fresh blood, but she forced it down. "Let's go," Tormund barked, pressing his hand to his own bleeding arm. "The gate's the key. This is our only chance." They dashed across the courtyard, weaving through the chaos. Everywhere, crows fought with wildlings who had somehow scaled parts of the wall or battered down smaller entrances. She glimpsed the savage forms of Thens locked in combat with black brothers. Screams tore through the night. The clang of steel on steel battered her ears. Through the swirl of bodies, they reached the mechanism that controlled the inner gate. A handful of watchers guarded it, determined to keep the wildlings from opening it. Tormund roared, hurling himself at them. Ygritte followed, dagger ready. They fought viciously. Tormund took a blow to his side, but rammed his attacker into the gear assembly, smashing the man's head. Ygritte ducked a swinging mace and managed to drive her dagger into another guard's kidney. He grunted and collapsed. One guard remained, a grizzled man with a grin set to his jaw. He recognized Tormund. "Giant's Bane," he spat, raising a sword. "Your head will decorate the ramparts, you savage." Tormund buried his axe in the man's shoulder. The guard let out a strangled cry, then slumped. Tormund wrenched the axe free, blood spraying. Panting, Ygritte surveyed the mechanism. It was a sturdy system of pulleys and gears meant to raise and lower the gate's massive iron-bound portcullis. The wildlings outside had battered down the outer gate, or so it sounded, but the inner portcullis remained. She saw the gear lock that needed to be disengaged to drop the portcullis or open it. Tormund cackled. "Help me break this. Mance and the giants can do the rest." She hesitated. Her mind flashed to Jon, to the potential slaughter that would ensue if the wildlings poured inside. But they were already dying out there, pinned between the outer gate and the portcullis. She steeled herself, remembering that for the free folk, it was freedom or death. If she did nothing, they might all die anyway. So she nodded, and together they hacked at the gear lock, dislodging metal rods and prying levers free. Sparks flew. The gate groaned under the tension. Then, with a resounding crash, the portcullis jerked open by a few feet, enough for a mammoth to slip its trunk under and start pulling from outside. The entire structure trembled. The wildlings outside bellowed triumphantly. Tormund let out a triumphant roar. "We did it! Ygritte, come on!" He grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the way as the gate parted further, revealing the looming shape of a mammoth and the silhouettes of free folk pouring through. The defenders tried to rally, but it was too late to stop the tide. Steel clashed, men screamed, the wildlings surged into the courtyard. Above the tumult, Ygritte spotted Ser Alisar Thorn on a parapet, face twisted in rage, shouting for the defenders to hold. He pointed his sword toward the gate mechanism, commanding archers to fire. But the archers found themselves under attack from behind, as more wildlings scaled the walls. The fortress had become a battlefield in every corner. Ygritte and Tormund found momentary cover behind an overturned cart. Ygritte's chest heaved, exhaustion and horror mingling in her veins. "What now?" she asked. Tormund grimaced, pressing a hand to the wound in his side. "We fight our way out. If the gates open, Mance's army should pour in, and the crows will have to retreat or be overwhelmed. We can't just stand here or we'll be cut down." She nodded, forcing herself to push aside the swirling memories. She had chosen to stand with her people. Jon was gone. Whatever final regrets she had, they no longer mattered. All that remained was survival. Together, they rose and charged deeper into the chaos, aiming to link up with other wildlings. The courtyard became a nightmare, flames licking the sky as buildings caught fire, the screams of men and animals reverberating. Ygritte loosed arrows she picked up from fallen bodies. Tormund swung his axe, and they carved a path among the swirling masses. Bodies of crows and wildlings alike littered the ground, blood turning the snow to slush. She glimpsed Samwell Tarly in the midst of the fray, wielding a crossbow. He looked terrified. Their eyes met for an instant. She hesitated, a pang in her chest. Then Tormund bellowed her name, yanking her away before she could process what she might have done in that moment. Would she have spared him, or would she have killed him? She would never know. The wildlings pushed the Night's Watch back, forcing them to yield the courtyard. Some crows fled to the tunnels beneath the wall, others mounted a last stand near the armory. Ser Alisar fought valiantly with a group of loyal men. Ygritte and Tormund slipped past them in the crush of bodies, battered but still alive. Within an hour, Castle Black's courtyard belonged to the wildlings. The Black brothers who survived either surrendered or retreated deeper into the tunnels. The gate was wide open. Mance Rayder himself entered, grim-faced and weary, leading a cluster of warriors. He surveyed the carnage with a heavy heart, for thousands on both sides had died for this. When Ygritte and Tormund finally reached Mance, they saw no sign of triumph in his face, only resignation. "We had no choice," he muttered when Tormund greeted him. "We can't stay north of the wall. Winter is coming." Tormund nodded, ragged. "Aye, we made our stand. This was the cost." Ygritte stood there, silent, battered, hardly able to stand. She saw men raising the Free Folks banners, an odd sight in Castle Black. A sense of numb disbelief settled over her. They had taken the stronghold, at least for now. But what would happen next? Did the rest of the Seven Kingdoms even know or care that the wall had fallen, that the Night's Watch was broken? In the days that followed, the wildlings attempted to hold Castle Black. Many Black brothers had been captured or killed. A few, like Samwell Tarly and Dolorous Ed, had slipped away into the tunnels. Ser Alisar Thorn was found among the dead in the courtyard, his sword still clutched in his stiff fingers. The Free Folk scoured the fortress for supplies, preparing to move south en masse. Some insisted on staying, seeing the wall as a defensible position against the others. But Mance Rayder wanted to press on to find land and safety for his people. The realm, however, would not greet them as liberators. Rumors spread that lords of the north were already amassing forces to repel the wildling incursion. Word of Jon Snow's death eventually reached them, though its significance was lost on most. He was just another casualty in a long list of tragedies. For Ygritte, life became a haze of regrets. She wandered the courtyards of Castle Black, haunted by the memory of Jon's lifeless form. She helped bury the dead free folk, and even some of the Night's Watch, though many black brothers had already been burned to prevent them from rising again. She took no pleasure in the conquest. The cost was too great. One night, as the free folk prepared for a mass southern migration, Tormund found Ygritte standing near the broken gate, staring out at the vast whiteness beyond. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "You'll come with us, won't you?" he asked, voice subdued. "Head south. Find a new life?" She didn't turn. That's what Jon wanted. A life beyond fighting, beyond the wall. "It feels empty now." Tormund sighed. "Aye, but we keep living. That's all we can do." She nodded slowly. "I'll come." She glanced back at the fortress, once the bastion of the Night's Watch. Now it was a shell, battered and stained with blood. The men in black who remained were mostly locked up or had fled. The great library was left intact, though rummaged by the free folk who didn't see the value in dusty books. Ygritte thought of how Jon had loved reading, had once told her stories of the heroes of old. A lump rose in her throat. When the free folk finally set forth, their numbers swelled by those who had been behind the wall for generations. They left a token garrison behind at Castle Black, uncertain if it was wise or even feasible to hold it. The next threat might come from the north in the form of whites and White Walkers, or from the south in the shape of northern lords raising armies. The free folk were trapped between these two threats. But forward they went, with Mance Rayder at their head, determined to find a new home or die trying. Ygritte walked among them, silent. She knew her fate was bound to this exodus now. There would be no return to the innocence of the cave, no second chance with Jon Snow. He was gone, and she carried that loss like a wound that refused to heal. Sometimes, she thought she saw him in the corner of her eye, only to turn and face emptiness. As they traveled south, scattered along the King's Road, the free folk encountered small villages, holdfasts, places that had heard the rumors of the wildling horde. Fearful locals often fled at their approach, leaving behind only shuttered windows and barred doors. Some tried to resist, brandishing farm implements, but they were swiftly overpowered. Mance did his best to keep order, instructing his people not to harm those who surrendered. But with so many thousands, order was tenuous. Skirmishes broke out, tensions flared. Food was scarce. Still, day after day, they trudged forward, Tormund keeping an eye on Ygritte, giving her tasks, trying to help her find purpose. She scouted ahead occasionally, her keen eyes spotting potential ambushes or game. But her heart was not in it. She moved like a shadow of her former self. The fiery spirit that had once defined her was dampened by grief. One evening, around a small campfire near the road, Tormund and Ygritte sat together, sharing a piece of stale bread. Others nearby sang softly or told tales. Ygritte barely listened. Tormund cleared his throat. "You know, I used to tease that crow about you. I said he'd never be true free folk, not with a foot in both worlds. But for a while he was with us. More than I realized at the time." She nodded, staring at the embers. "He was. We were." Tormund hesitated, then placed a large hand over hers. "He gave us time, you know, in his own way. Without Jon, we wouldn't have gotten as far as we did. Maybe in the end, you gave us time too, by opening that gate." A tear slipped down her cheek, glowing in the firelight. But was it worth it? So many died. He sighed heavily. "War is never worth it. We just survive. That's all." They watched the sparks dance into the night sky, carried by the wind. Ygritte listened to the hush of the darkness, imagining the swirling snow of the far north, the lonely cry of the wind. She missed the wall in a strange way, missed the crisp air that she and Jon had once breathed together. But the wall was no longer a barrier that separated them. It was now a path of blood leading south. Far in the distance, a wolf howled, a mournful note that sent a shiver down her spine. She wondered if the old gods were watching, if ghosts walked among them. Perhaps Jon's spirit lingered somewhere, watching her from beyond. The thought brought no comfort. In the weeks and months to come, the free folk would continue their trek deeper into the Seven Kingdoms, scattering as they went, clashing with local lords, forging uneasy alliances or burning villages that resisted. Word would spread of a wildling invasion led by Raider. Southern armies would march north to repel them, not comprehending the real threat that might come from the White Walkers. Blood would stain the fields of the north. And somewhere among that tide of refugees and warriors, Ygritte walked on, her red hair a beacon of the life she'd once shared with Jon Snow, a living reminder of a love that briefly bridged the gap between wildling and crow. Her sorrow weighed on her, but she kept moving. She didn't know if she would find redemption or a violent end on this journey south. But there was nothing left for her in the north except memories and regret. Sometimes, in the lonely hours just before dawn, she felt an overwhelming sense that she had taken the wrong path, that she should have lowered her bow that night on the battlements. The arrow's flight replayed in her mind, again and again, as though looking for a different outcome. But regrets were powerless now. She could not turn back time, nor bring Jon Snow back from the grave. And so the world moved on without its bastard of Winterfell, without the man who might have brokered a fragile peace or led the Watch to a different future. The Night's Watch, in the wake of Castle Black's fall, was a shadow of its former self, some brothers scattered, others dead, and a handful living under wildling rule at the fortress. The wall was effectively breached. The realm above the neck would soon learn that the free folk were not the only threat. But by then, it might be too late for anyone to unite against the coming darkness. In the hush of a brittle dawn, Ygritte stood on a hill overlooking a stretch of barren fields. A flock of crows took flight from a lone tree, their dark shapes swirling against the pale sky. She wondered if Jon was among them in spirit, if he could see her. She whispered to the wind, a simple farewell she had never been able to speak at his pyre. The breeze carried her words away, lost among the rustle of dead grass. Yet in her heart, she carried him still. The memory of his smile, his gentleness, his stubborn sense of honor. Those memories were all that remained. She would guard them fiercely, even as the world descended into new wars and old hatreds. She would not let anyone take from her the truth of what they'd once shared, however brief, however doomed. It was all she had left to hold on to, a spark of warmth in a world gone cold. And so the story turned on a single arrow loosed in anger and heartbreak. The future of the Night's Watch was forever altered, its sworn brothers scattered or dead, its stronghold in the hands of those who had once been kept out. Winter's chill deepened, creeping across the land like a relentless tide, indifferent to the wars of men and wildlings alike. If Jon Snow had lived, perhaps a different chapter would have been written, one of unity in the face of an ancient menace. Instead, the wall stood no longer as an unbreachable shield, but as a reminder that even the mightiest defenses can fall when trust is broken and love gives way to tragedy. In the end, all that remained were the echoes of what might have been, drifting across the silent snows. The final sigh of a man who once vowed to hold the wall, and the sorrowful lament of a woman who had loved him enough to break her own heart with an arrow, and in so doing, changed the fate of the North forever.